Welcome everyone to another video, and in this video we are going to be answering the two different questions really. First question is when it's Medicham versus Medicham, what should I do? And then second question is, should I deviate from the conventional moveset of counter, power punch, and ice punch? Nothing fancy in this video. We're going to walk through some analysis that I've already prepared, and then I'm going to summarize at the very end. What are the takeaways and conclusions that you should be thinking about in terms of this analysis? Because this matchup is definitely going to come up in regionals, so I want to make sure that everyone is prepared the best that they can. So let's take a look. I prepared a bunch of links here. There's nothing fancy here. We're just going to dive into the numbers, into the details, so that you can understand how I come to these conclusions. So you look under the no shield scenario. This could be at the very end or the very beginning where you're choosing not to shield for whatever reason. You'll see that one Medicham is only doing Ice Punch and the other Medicham is doing Power Punch. And you'll see under the no shield scenario, the Power Punch user wins. And there's a couple of reasons for this. One is that counter increases in damage. In fact, interestingly, counter does 4 damage initially to each other, and even after one stage attack boost, you'll see that counter still only does 4. But after 2 stage boosts and then after 3 stage boosts, you'll see that counter goes from 4, it goes 4, 4, 5, 6, and that incremental damage is definitely adding up. You'll see here that the incremental damage here is 5 when it's the damage 5, and then another 4 because 2 and 2, so 9 in total, which is enough to overcome. And then as well, the fact that Power Punches 1 turn earlier, takes 1 less counter than Ice Punch to get to, which means that that you can get a third Power Punch in addition to this additional damage that overcomes the difference in total damage from Ice Punches. So if you see here, there's 2 Ice Punches. They do 30 damage each. The first Power Punch does 16. The second one does 20. And the third one does 24. So if we look at that, that's also 6. That's interesting. That's also 60 damage. But obviously, you trade off one counter, which is how you end up getting to this particular scenario. But is that the case always in all shielding scenarios? If you each have 1 shield left, you'll see that doing Ice Punch actually puts you ahead. And the reason why is that because you are able to shield, that means that you can get to a third Ice Punch, which is interesting, and that allows you to overcome the difference from the counter damage. Obviously, because the 30 damage is a lot, and then as well you're choosing to block their most significant Power Punch. But when you go to the 2 shield scenario, there's a couple nuances to how PV Poke actually handles this, which is actually quite interesting. Is that when you go to the 2 shield scenario, you'll see that it's actually the case where PV Poke showing it's supposed to be 2 and 2, but it actually only ends up showing that you're blocking the last Power Punch as opposed to blocking the second last, and that's because it's very close. It's on the cusp of doing another Power Punch, so you can actually manipulate this in sandbox mode to get a more accurate picture. Because like if they keep doing Power Punch, they're never going to get to a 4th one. They're going to KO the Medicham before it's able to get a 4th one off. So if we were to sandbox mode this, and instead of for example, they could instead choose to do a Power Punch here, which I actually wouldn't recommend that you. I guess they could shield this as well. Then you'll see that the Power Punch user end up winning, anyways. Still, just because they're not that close to another. Actually, they're probably another counter off, another 2 counters off from getting off in Ice Punch, and that's because the amount of damage that Power Punch is doing, counter is doing now after it's been boosted, is quite insane, and is doing a ton of damage to Medicham. So if you're in the no shield scenario, it's better just to straight power punches than an ice punch. If you're in the one shield scenario, then it's better to do ice punches as opposed to power punches. And then if you're in the two shield scenario and you're on your last Pokemon, then it's better to just keep power punching, because the amount of damage you're going to be doing is going to change this result pretty significantly. And if we look here, power punch, ice punch versus power up punch, you'll see here under the one shield scenario, power punch and then an ice punch at the end does overcome power punch even more. And then if we look at ice punch, you'll see that it makes way more sense to go for 2 power punches than an ice punch at the end, and then you'll win by a pretty significant margin. So it's better to get those 2 stage boosts than use an ice punch than strictly using power punch or dynamic punch. So hopefully that's clear. People understand what you need to do in the mirror. Power up punches. In this case, like even if you did ice punches and you did power punch then, it's because then you'll tie in terms of your priority, which is a little bit risky here because it's relying on you being able to hit this power punch in time, which I'm confident you can, which will result in a tie. So hopefully that's clear and people understand what they need to do there. So the question here is Psycho Cut versus counter. So what are the trade-offs there? So with Psycho Cut, you are doing neutral damage because Psychic will resist, but it's super effective against fighting. And then as well, you're getting a slight increase in energy. So you'll see here that you're generating 9 energy as opposed to 7, which means that you can get to Ice Punch 1 turn earlier, and as well Power Up Punch one turn earlier. And you'll see that here, if you were to just do Psycho Cuts, you'll see that you can get to 3 Ice Punches, but the amount of damage that Power Up Punches is doing or amount of damage that counter will end up doing will overcome the fact that you're doing 3 Ice Punches as opposed to them being the counter user of doing 2 Ice Punches and a Power Up Punch. And if we look at like only counter and Power Up Punch, you'll see that it's tie. And if we end up looking at only Ice Punch, you'll see that counter ends up winning. And even it's actually quite interesting. Even though Ice Punch, they end up getting a 3rd Ice Punch off, you'll see that the difference in counter and Psycho Cut damage is enough for it to overcome. But again, if we literally just go back to here, you'll see that counter ends up winning in all 3 scenarios. Even let's manipulate this a little bit. Let's go. Let's apply Power Punches wherever we can. And then, actually, this is exactly the same. Actually, no, don't worry about this. This would be the same as when we did the analysis with just Power Punches. I guess you could change this to the last one to be Ice Punch. No, you cannot. All right, so you can only get to another Power Punch here. But this is, I don't know what I'm actually doing. This is the exact same as, let's see here if we actually can get to an Ice Punch. I guess we can get to an Ice Punch here. And then you'll end up seeing that counter ends up winning just because the amount of damage difference is pretty significant between the two. So in the mirror match, Psycho Cut does not help you, even though it's neutral, and counter is resisted, which is actually really interesting. And that just tells you like how broken Power Punch is. So then the next question is if you use Psychic versus Ice Punch, assuming we've established that counter in the mirror match is better. But let's think about what's actually better here, Psychic or Power Punch. And you'll see here that According to how PvPoke is doing it, Psychic ends up doing a lot of damage and is much more energy efficient than Ice Punch or Power Up Punch. I'm not sure why it did in this order in the no shield scenario. I actually would have preferred if it did Power Up Punch here and then did looks like it's let's change this to counter, and then let's change this to Psychic here. Not sure if it could do it earlier. And then let's change this to Power Up Punch, and then Ice Punch should be here. This always gets like very weird. I kind of have to do it evenly here. Anyways, this is what it takes to do this analysis. There you go, Psychic. You'll see that Psychic ends up winning by even more. I'm not sure why PvPoke did Psychic first, then counter. I think what it inherently does is that it does the more energy efficient move first, and then only does a Power Punch. So anyways, if PvPoke owner is watching this, Power Punch is like a slightly different scenario. And then you'll see here that with Psychic, it ends up winning all the shielding scenarios. But this does rely on the fact that you bait out the Power Up Punch. You'll see here that it does counter much later. So that's like a pretty big reliance if they end up not taking the bait and then end up blocking your Psychic later on. So let's play out this scenario here. They choose not to block here, right? And then they end up choosing to block shielding this one here. You'll see that in this case, the Power Punch and Ice Punch user ends up winning in the two shield scenario. So again, sometimes like you can win in these shielding scenarios, but it relies on your ability to bait out the shield, thinking that they're gonna do a Power Up Punch, but thinking that they're gonna do a Psychic, so I have to block it. But if you end up baiting up the Power Up Punch, then it becomes very challenging later on to get off the Psychic. So if you can guess correctly, Power Up Punch, Ice Punch ends up beating Psychic and Power Up Punch. So it's very important to when you look at this chart, dive into the details and understand. Okay, do I need to bait or not? And that's something that I'm not sure how easy or hard it is to program that, but something to consider. But for the most part, if you want to win with a no shield scenario, then doing Psychic makes sense, but does come with some trade-offs. So let's talk about those trade-offs here. Let's first talk about Cycle Cut versus counter versus the overall meta. So generally, it does worse against the main meta. What I mean by that is that in certain situations and scenarios, it actually doesn't help you at all, because counter either does really good neutral damage or does super effective damage. So against Malmetal, Bastion, etc. But there are certain situations where it does just barely better than counter. So such against Altaria, Tropius, and Venusaur. But there are situations where Cycle Cut does significantly better than counter, and that's mostly the situations where Cycle Cut is super effective and Power Punch is resisted or double resisted. So let's take a look at this first scenario here. You'll see that counter Power Punch, Ice Punch against Haunter, which is one of the main counters that you're going to see in that. You see Haunter just absolutely ruins Medicham, and Medicham doesn't really have much of a chance against Haunter. But if you look at Cycle Cut, Medicham, you'll see that under the one shield scenario, first off, the amount of damage that Cycle Cut is doing, which is 3 versus 5, because it is super effective, and then and the counter is triple resisted. You'll see here that under the even shielding scenario, Medicham ends up tying with Haunter. But again, that assumes that you can bait with the Power Punch which is again still tricky to deal with. But you know, I'm curious here if the amount of damage you're doing is psycho. No, you need the ice punch. So if Haunter can shield the right charge move at the right time, then it's still going to beat Medicham. But at least Psycho Cut gives you a fighting chance against one of its main counters of Haunter. And if we look here, so we look here with Psycho Cut. Actually, let's look at counter first. Sorry, I'm trying to scroll slowly here. You'll see that Medicham can only win under the 2 shield scenario. It gets absolutely destroyed in the 0 and 1 shield scenario, and the 2 shield scenario is actually able to overcome it because counters are able to outpace the poison jabs, and then as well it's able to, because it's so cheap in energy, it's able to trade off and get a free. It's actually quite interesting here. You end up in the same scenario where you end up not shielding, because then you have a full power punch here, but instead of going for the power punch, you actually just do the counter instead of the power punch, and that makes sense even in endgame scenario, because they can take 1 turn to block and do 1 HP, or you can do 6 HP damage with a counter. But then again, if you look at Psycho Cut, you still end up losing the no shield scenario, but it's actually much closer, and then you end up dominating the 1 and 2 shield scenario. And if what I talked about here, that where it does slightly worse, so if you look against Azumarill, where you think that this is something where Psycho Cut is neutral and Power Punch is resisted, you'll see here that you end up losing every scenario against Azumarill versus you'll see you end up like tying with the potential to tie against Azumarill just by doing power punches, just because mostly because you get off the same number of power punches, but you'll see that the way that the damage formula applies against Azumarill with counter, you end up winning, or end up tying, I should say tying, with Azumarill when using counter, which is a little bit unintuitive, which is why I talk about you have to be able to counter both has to be resisted, or double resisted, or triple resisted, and Psycho Cut has to be super effective in order for these scenarios to apply. When you look at Ice Punch versus Psychic, you'll see that without Ice Punch, you end up losing against Tropius, against Altaria. You end up having like interesting scenarios, and we'll kind of walk through them. Actually, we can just walk through it here. So I'll put counter here against Azumarill. You'll see with Psychic, it actually doesn't end up like helping you in any scenario here. Actually, no, this should be Ice Punch. And you end up, what am I looking at here? Yeah. Sorry, you end up losing. That's interesting, actually. You end up tying under the 2 shield scenario here. But why do you end up not tying here? It's not like you're doing any. You're only doing power up punches here. Let's see here. Sorry, I'm slightly confused here. What's happening here? Play rough, ice beam. Yeah, it is. Okay. So I'm doing 2 ice beams, and then a count, and then a power punch here. Oh, so what ended up here is like, in order to bait, you end up doing the power punch later on. It's actually a little bit confusing here. I'm glad that I caught this on video. So because you end up doing the 2 shield scenario, it causes you to bait, which means you do your power punch later, as opposed to when you do your power punches here. It ends up being the same, so Psychic ended up not being that relevant. If you were to do it here, you actually want to flip this scenario here. But again, you'll see that Psychic doesn't really do you too much favors, because in most scenarios you want to be doing Power Up Punch to get the boost in counters. Then you end up wanting to do Psychic. So it's interesting there. Okay, but let's take a look at some matchups where Psychic does help you. So first one is Venusaur here. So this is counter Ice Punch, Power Up Punch. And you'll see here against Venusaur, you end up losing in the no shield scenario. You end up tying in the 1 shield scenario, and you end up winning in the 2 shield scenario. And then with Psychic, it actually ends up being the inverse, where you win in the no shield scenarios, you tie in the 1 shield scenario, and then you end up losing in the 2 shield scenario. And that's because you end up only doing power punches, and then you're doing your power punch later than you would with Ice Punch, because when you're trying to bait the shields, that means that you're getting less boost in your counters relative, so then you end up losing that situation. So, but again, you can mitigate this by, for example, if you end up with like a 2 shield scenario, you can come up with a slightly better situation where you just straight up do power up punches, and then hoping that they eventually, well, obviously they have to eventually shield, but if they don't, then that's fine with you. So if they end up like not shielding, not sure, oh, I gotta go sandbox mode. If they end up like not shielding this attack, then they're in trouble on their point of view. So something to think about as you play out these scenarios, that if you end up with Venusaur with a 1 or 2 shield scenario, that if you can get the second power up punch off clean, then you're pretty much home free. I would be shocked if they didn't shield this power up punch. Yeah, because like at this point in time, you've already got 1 power punch off, and then they're at 57. They're about half their health, and if they tank another one, it's like pretty bad news for them. You can probably just pretty much just counter them down at this point in time. You just need to do, after this, you just need to do 6 counters. You don't even need to do this power punch. You know, the being like a really good scenario for you. So again, if you can get 2 power punches off clean versus them, because the conventional thing is like don't shield early power punches, then you end up in a not so favorable situation. And then we like another example with Tentacruel. I feel like we're always picking on Tentacruel. That's because of its underlying psychic poison typing, where it's just counter but is weak against psychic. So again, you end up winning in the 2 shield scenario, and then here with psychic you end up winning in all scenarios with psychic. So overall, counter. Overall, you want to do more power up punches early on, and then finish off with an ice punch to end up winning the scenarios. It's rare where you want to start off a mirror match with an ice punch, just because you want to get the boost in power up punches. Obviously, when we go here and we go up against ice punch, it becomes more, you want to get to the 2 power punches then hit an ice punch. But if we were to flip this and then sandbox mode this, doesn't actually look like you can get to it. But anyways, so you want to understand these different scenarios where you want to do power punch. Generally, you want to do more power punches early on to get the boost, and then finish off with an ice punch where appropriate. And then counter, if you're looking for the mirror match, counter outpaces Psycho Cut in the mirror match, and then ice punch. Psychic does allow you to win against an ice punch user. So if you are looking to win in the mirror match and that's all you care about, then using psychic over ice punch matters. But understand that comes with a trade-off, and we'll talk a little bit about that trade-off again. With Psycho Cut versus counter, it generally does worse against main meta, and then barely does better against like Tropius, Venusaur, Altaria. Basically, you can get those ice punches faster, but does worse against like them across the meta. And then has key matchups against Haunter and Tentacruel, which are going to be two counters to Medicham, especially Haunter. And then Ice Punch versus Psyche, you'll see that it kind of inverses the relationship with Venusaur, but you can overcome that just by doing power punches earlier and not baiting. And then against Tentacruel, it does much better against Tentacruel. So hopefully you found that helpful. Let me know if there's any other deep dive mirror matches or certain scenarios that you wanted me to walk through. I'm more than happy to do that. If you guys like this video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up. Don't forget to comment below on what else you want to see, and let me know when your regional cup tournament is. And if you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe, and I will see everyone in the next video.